feel like I'm not going to see him again, even though I know I'm going to. I'm making these plans, but I'm thinking, what if they fall through? What if it's more than 6 months?
That means when you get back to America, you have to make inquiry how I will get to America, right?
I'm going to do that, babe. I am going to get in touch with an immigration lawyer.
She might go back to her country and she might change her mind on most of the promises, like bringing me to her country, the visa.
Daniel is crying so hard at the airport that the whole scene looks like a tragic love story, and Lisa is falling apart right in front of him like she is leaving the man she truly believes she fought for, suffered for, and chose through all the mess. But the second you stop staring at the tears and start listening to what this goodbye is built on, the scene turns into something much darker. Because this does not look like two people losing the same relationship, this looks like two people standing in the same pain for two very different reasons. And that difference is where the whole story starts to get ugly. On the surface, this is easy to read. A woman has to leave. A man does not want her to go. They cling to each other, they break down, they drag out the goodbye, and every part of the moment begs the audience to say the same thing. This must be real. This must be love. This must be proof. But reality TV lives off one dirty little trick. The most emotional scene is not always the most honest one. Sometimes the biggest tears show the biggest fear. And fear is not the same thing as love. Fear of losing a person is one thing. Fear of losing what that person represents is something else. And with Daniel and Lisa, that question hangs over this airport scene like a storm cloud no one wants to name. Because once you strip away the hugging, the crying, the desperate little promises, and the look at my picture energy, you are left with a brutal possibility. Lisa is grieving the relationship she thinks she has. Daniel is grieving the future he thinks is slipping out of reach. Those are not the same loss. They are not even close. One is emotional. One is structural. One is about attachment. One is about access. And when both people are crying in the same frame while chasing two different outcomes, the goodbye stops looking simple and starts looking like a collision. That is what makes this scene hit so hard. Not the tears by themselves, the contradiction inside them. Lisa looks like someone who still wants the fantasy to win. She wants the romance to survive the lies, the humiliation, the tension, the chaos, all of it. She wants the suffering to mean something. People do this all the time. The harder the road was, the more they want the ending to feel worth it. So when she breaks down, there's a sense that she is mourning love, or at least mourning the version of love she has been trying to force into existence. She is not crying over paperwork. She is not crying over process. She is crying over the story in her head, the one where all this madness still leads to closeness, marriage, and some clean emotional payoff after all the damage. Daniel is harder to read, and that is where the scene gets interesting. Because no, the smart read is not to flatten him into some cartoon villain who feels nothing and performs everything. That read is lazy. The sharper read is that he does feel something, but feeling something is not the same as wanting the same thing. He looks devastated. Yes. He looks panicked. Yes. He looks like a man watching something precious leave. Yes. But what is precious to him, Lisa herself, or the life path wrapped around Lisa? And once that question enters the room, every tear starts to wobble. His pain does not stop being real. Its meaning starts getting unstable. That is the engine of this whole first moment. Two people holding on. Two people terrified. Two people speaking the language of heartbreak. Yet underneath the language, the motives do not line up. Lisa seems afraid the relationship will die. Daniel seems afraid the plan will die. Lisa is losing a person. Daniel is losing a route. Lisa is trying to keep love alive. Daniel is trying to keep the future from closing. Same hug, same airport, same breakdown, different panic. And once you see that split, the whole scene changes shape. The tears stop feeling like the answer and start feeling like the bait. Because tears are persuasive. Tears make people lower their guard. Tears make ugly situations look pure for a minute. Tears make audiences want to believe in the most flattering version of what they are watching. But tears do not explain motive. Tears do not clean up contradiction. Tears do not erase the fact that two people standing in the same goodbye might be mourning two separate things, and in this case, that is the part worth watching. Because this was never only about heartbreak. It was about what each of them thought this relationship was supposed to deliver, and the airport did not settle that question. It exposed it. By the time they get to the airport, the scene looks huge and tragic, but the final morning already told a quieter truth. Because even before the crying and the clinging and the dramatic goodbye, the relationship was showing the same imbalance in a smaller, uglier form. And it showed up in a moment that was awkward, intimate, and weirdly revealing. Which is why it matters more than people think. Because when a couple is close, relaxed, and talking about what happened the night before, that is usually where motive slips out without meaning to. Lisa brings up the missing promise from the night before, and the subject is physical. But the deeper issue is not physical at all. The issue is timing. The issue is deferral. The issue is one person asking for something now and the other person pushing the reward into some hazy future where commitment comes first and delivery comes later. Daniel does not shut the door completely. That would be too clean. He does something more useful for someone trying to keep a shaky relationship alive. He leaves the door open just enough to keep hope breathing. He does not say never. He says later. He does not give certainty. He gives possibility. And that difference matters because possibility is often enough to keep someone emotionally invested when proof is missing. That is the pattern sitting underneath this whole exchange. Daniel seems to understand that a flat refusal would create a problem, so he offers the softer substitute, which is future language, after marriage, later on, in time, once things are official. Once the next step happens. It sounds cooperative on the surface, but if you step back for 1 second, the shape of it is familiar. Lisa is being asked to keep trusting the relationship based on what it might become, not what it is giving her right now. She is being asked to carry belief on credit, and Daniel is the one issuing the credit. Lisa, for her part, walks straight into that setup, and that is where the scene stops being a crude reality TV moment and starts becoming a psychological clue. Because she does not treat future language like a red flag. She treats it like reassurance. She hears the delay and still extracts hope from it. She hears the lack of present action and still reads intention into it. That tells you something important about how she is moving through this relationship. She is not judging the bond by consistency. She is judging it by emotional suggestion. If the words point toward a future, she treats those words like evidence, even when the present is thin. And people do this all the time when they are desperate for a story to hold together. They take maybe and turn it into movement. They take later and turn it into commitment. They take a soft promise and dress it up like proof. Because the alternative is admitting the gap between what they want and what they are getting is much bigger than they want to face. Lisa is not only listening to Daniel. She is collaborating with the fantasy. She is helping the relationship stay inflated by accepting intention as a substitute for delivery. That is why this morning matters. It gives you a small model of the entire relationship. Daniel delays but does not detach. Lisa doubts but does not withdraw. He keeps her engaged with just enough future. She stays engaged with more faith than the moment deserves. He preserves access by promising tomorrow. She preserves hope by forgiving today. And when that cycle repeats long enough, the relationship starts running on emotional credit instead of concrete trust. The uncomfortable part is that this pattern can feel romantic in the moment. People dress it up as patience, sacrifice, working through issues, building toward marriage, all the nice phrases people use when the present is disappointing and the future is doing all the labor. But the sharp read is less flattering. If someone keeps asking for more commitment while moving the payoff further down the road, that is not always growth. Sometimes that is bait. Sometimes that is delay used as glue. Sometimes that is a way of keeping the other person hopeful without having to produce anything solid in the present. And to be fair, not every delayed promise is manipulation. Some people are awkward. Some people are inexperienced. Some people stall because they are nervous, embarrassed, or unsure. Fine. That is the fair-minded read. But the reason this moment lands differently here is because it does not sit alone. It sits inside a bigger relationship where delay, uncertainty, and future selling keep showing up in other forms too. Marriage gets framed as the point where things improve. Immigration talk points toward a better future once the next step is done. Stability always seems to live one stage ahead. The reward keeps waiting in the next room. Lisa only has to keep walking. So when she accepts that intimate promise for later, she is not only accepting one awkward answer about one awkward topic, she is revealing her whole operating system in this relationship. She wants to believe that what is missing now will appear once she proves enough loyalty, patience, money, trust, or commitment. Daniel, meanwhile, keeps the connection warm without fully cashing the checks his words are writing. That does not prove every feeling is fake. It proves the relationship is being managed through anticipation, which is why the final morning already carries the same warning the airport scene will later scream louder. This bond is not surviving on what has been delivered. It is surviving on what keeps being promised next, and once a relationship starts running on future language like that, you are no longer watching simple romance. You are watching someone spend hope as if hope itself were proof, and that was never only about chemistry. Once you widen the camera past the airport and the final morning, the trip starts to look less like a love story under pressure and more like a stress test that both people graded in completely different ways. Because this trip was not smooth, cute, healing, or reassuring, it was full of lies. Coming out, awkward confrontations, family tension, emotional embarrassment, and the kind of chaos that usually forces a couple to ask whether they still trust each other at all, yet somehow both Lisa and Daniel walk out of the same wreckage feeling encouraged. And that is one of the biggest clues in the whole story, because when two people survive the same disaster and come away with different meanings, you are no longer watching shared reality, you are watching parallel fantasy. Lisa seems to look at the trip and think we made it through, which for her becomes emotional proof, not legal proof, not practical proof, emotional proof, the kind people cling to when they want a relationship to feel deeper than the humiliation it has already caused them. Because once you have lied, fought, cried, explained yourself, faced judgment, and still ended the trip holding hands, it becomes tempting to say this must be real. Otherwise, why would we still be here? Why would we still be trying? Why would we still be together after all this damage? And that is such a human trap. Because surviving chaos does not always mean love got stronger, sometimes it only means both people were too invested in their own goal to walk away when they should have. That is where Lisa's reading of the trip starts to tell on her. She treats endurance like evidence. She treats the fact that Daniel stayed, forgave, adjusted, or at least kept moving forward as if all of that proves the relationship has depth. In her mind, the mess almost gives the bond more value. They did not have a clean romance, so the struggle itself starts becoming part of the romance. The suffering becomes a receipt, the embarrassment becomes a badge. The harder the trip was, the more she seems to want the ending to feel meaningful, because otherwise she has to face a brutal possibility, which is that all the stress, all the lies, all the mess did not lead to a deeper relationship. It only exposed how unstable the foundation already was. Daniel appears to leave the same trip with a colder kind of relief. Not cold as in emotionless, cold as in outcome focus. He does not seem to read the survival of the trip as proof of some great spiritual bond. He seems to read it as proof that the arrangement is still alive. The opportunity is still breathing. The road did not close. That difference matters. Lisa sees survival and thinks we must be meant to be. Daniel sees survival and thinks the plan did not die. Same events, same arguments, same family pressure, same public awkwardness, same exhausting trip, but the conclusion each person draws from that survival points in a different direction. And the family pressure matters here more than people admit, because once relatives, expectations, approvals, and cultural rituals start pressing down on a relationship, weak intentions usually start leaking out. People get impatient. They pull back. They stop performing. Instead, Daniel keeps going. He stays in the process. He sticks with the trip. He keeps the connection alive after secrets come out that easily might have derailed everything. Lisa reads that as devotion. The tougher read is that staying in the process is not always the same as staying for love. If the relationship still serves a major purpose, people tolerate a shocking amount of dysfunction. Humans do this constantly. They call persistence romantic when persistence is sometimes strategic. That does not mean Daniel felt nothing. That easy villain reading is too thin to be useful. The more believable read is that he had enough emotional attachment to keep showing up, but not enough evidence to separate his attachment from his objective. That is why the trip aftermath is so important. It gives both people a reason to keep believing, but the belief is built on different math. Lisa thinks all the pain purified the relationship. Daniel thinks all the pain did not kill the route. Lisa sees endurance as intimacy. Daniel sees endurance as viability. And once that split locks in, every attempt to patch things up starts carrying two meanings at once. The apologies sound emotional to Lisa and functional to Daniel. The reconciliation feels romantic to Lisa and stabilizing to Daniel. The effort to move past the lies feels like proof of commitment to her, while to him it feels like the necessary repair work to keep momentum going. That is why the aftermath matters more than the fights themselves. The fights are messy television. The interpretations after the fights are the real story. Because if two people leave the same mess holding opposite conclusions, then the relationship is already divided at the level that counts most. Lisa seems to think we survived because love won. Daniel seems to think we survived because the future is still possible. She wants the trip to justify the feeling. He wants the trip to preserve the outcome. She is trying to convert chaos into romance. He is trying to convert chaos into continuity. And that gap starts getting painfully obvious once the trip ends and the next question arrives. Because Lisa sounds like someone who wants to stay and make the feeling permanent, while Daniel sounds like someone who wants certainty. A timeline, a process, something solid enough to stop this whole thing from slipping through his hands. The clean ending both of them seem to be chasing never arrived. And that failure matters more than any airport tear, because once the trip did not end in marriage, the whole story lost its fantasy cover and started showing its hard edges, since Daniel did not seem to want this trip to finish with. Another vague promise, or one more emotional scene to hold on to, he wanted something locked in, something official, something done. While Lisa seemed much more attached to the emotional payoff of staying, being close, dragging the romance a little longer, and turning all this chaos into a dramatic love win, but those are not the same goal, and when neither one happens, the relationship gets shoved out of dream territory and into the cold space where timing, law, paperwork, money, and pressure start doing the talking. That is the point where a messy romance stops behaving like a romance and starts behaving like a deadline problem. Daniel clearly seems to have wanted this trip to end with certainty. Marriage on the trip would have solved the ugliest part of the suspense for him. It would have turned fear into structure. It would have made the future feel less slippery. It would have reduced the risk of Lisa going back to America and cooling off, changing her mind, getting distracted, running into obstacles, or finally having enough distance to question the whole thing. Marriage would not have solved every issue, but it would have changed the balance. It would have given him something fixed. That matters. Lisa, on the other hand, seems to be reaching for a different kind of ending. One based less on closure and more on emotional extension. She talks like someone who would rather stay in Nigeria and keep the feeling alive than snap back into the ordinary life waiting for her back home. That is a huge clue, because it shows what each person was trying to get from the final stretch of the trip. Daniel wanted the relationship secured. Lisa wanted the relationship prolonged. Daniel wanted official progress. Lisa wanted emotional continuation. He was leaning toward a locked door. She was leaning toward one more night with the music still playing, even though the music in this case was mostly lies, stress, confusion, and public embarrassment. Which is bleak, but humans are stubborn creatures and often try to squeeze romance out of a burning house. Once marriage does not happen, the trip loses the illusion of being self-contained. Up to that point, a trip can still pretend to be its own little world. People can hide inside the mood of the visit. They can tell themselves the intensity means more than the complication. They can keep treating the relationship like a feeling. But once the marriage timing slips and the legal issues refuse to cooperate, the outside world crashes in. Suddenly, the relationship is no longer a trip. It is a process. And processes are ruthless. They ask questions feelings cannot answer. Are you legally free to marry? How long will the visa take? Which route is possible? Who pays? Who waits? Who works? Who sacrifices? Who panics first? That shift is brutal because chemistry thrives in immediacy, while immigration lives in delay. This is where the gap between trip romance and real immigration pressure becomes impossible to ignore. A trip runs on adrenaline. An immigration process runs on patience, money, scrutiny, deadlines, forms, and uncertainty. A trip lets people perform closeness. A process asks whether closeness survives logistics. A trip can make chaos feel thrilling. A process makes chaos expensive. So once the marriage did not happen on this trip, the relationship had no choice but to step into a harder reality, and Daniel seems to understand that fast. You can almost feel the tone change. The dreamy emotional language starts giving way to urgency. The fantasy of a clean romantic ending is gone. Now there are questions. Now there is risk. Now there is time for Lisa to go home and think. That last part is what seems to haunt him most. Distance is dangerous to any relationship built more on intensity than stability. The second Lisa gets back to America, the whole situation changes. She is no longer inside the emotional weather of Nigeria. She is back inside her normal life, her routine, her financial limits, her work, her own legal mess, her own doubts, and people back home who might start asking the questions she has been avoiding. The trip feeling weakened. The airport goodbye cannot carry the whole relationship forever. Daniel seems to know that. Marriage on the trip would have protected against some of it. Without that protection, everything starts feeling exposed. And that is why this failed timing is not a side issue. It is the hinge. Because before this point, the relationship can still pretend to be about love winning through struggle. After this point, the story starts sounding like a scramble to stop the future from slipping away. Lisa is still chasing the emotional meaning of the relationship. Daniel starts chasing certainty with more urgency. He no longer has the comfort of saying they are almost there in some soft, dreamy sense. Now he needs action. He needs a plan. He needs movement. He needs something stronger than tears and promises. And once a person starts needing that much certainty that fast, the tone changes whether they admit it or not. The romance stops leading, and pressure takes the wheel. The second Daniel starts talking about America in direct, urgent terms, the whole relationship shifts into focus. Because up to this point, people can still argue about romance, chemistry, cultural pressure, awkward affection, and whether the tears mean love or fear. But when he starts zeroing in on what Lisa needs to do the moment she gets back, when he starts talking about inquiry, lawyers, which route gets him there faster, and whether she might change her mind once she is back on American soil, the story stops feeling vague and starts feeling structured. And that structure tells you more than the crying ever could. This is the spine of the whole thing. Not the hugging, not the airport panic by itself, not even the messy trip, the visa talk. Because a lot of people say love is the center of a relationship, but in this case, love sounds more like the soft language wrapped around the harder mechanism underneath. The harder mechanism is movement, access, entry, timeline, progress. The reason this matters so much is simple. When people tell you what they fear losing, they often reveal what they value most. And Daniel does not sound like a man whose first terror is emotional distance in the abstract. He sounds like a man terrified that once Lisa returns to America, she will cool off, delay, hesitate, get distracted, rethink the whole plan, or fail to move fast enough to keep this future alive. That fear is not hidden. It is not subtle. He says she might go back to her country and change her mind on the promise, on bringing him there, on the visa. That is a giant flashing sign in the middle of the story. Because once he frames the loss in those terms, the audience is no longer guessing at random. His own words give the relationship a skeleton. Suddenly, the panic has shape. Suddenly, the goodbye has stakes beyond separation. Suddenly, the tears are attached to a practical fear that changes the emotional reading of everything around them. And notice the timing. This is not some distant conversation about the future after months of stable planning and mutual clarity. This comes right as the trip is ending, right after marriage on the trip did not happen, right when distance is about to return, and with it the risk of delay, doubt, and exposure. So his urgency does not drop into the story out of nowhere. It arrives at the exact point where informal romance has failed to secure what he wanted. That is what makes the lawyer talk and the visa route talk land so hard. They do not feel like neutral planning, they feel like contingency mode. Now, to be fair, long-distance couples do often get practical fast. That is the strongest counterpoint here, and it deserves to be taken seriously. When people live in different countries, logistics are not some cold extra. They are built into the relationship from the start. Who moves? How? When? Under what visa? With what money? Those questions are part of the bond whether anyone likes it or not. So a person talking quickly about paperwork or timelines is not automatic proof of bad motive. Adults in cross-border relationships have to think about process. That part is normal. But normal logistics and loaded urgency are not the same thing, and that is where Daniel's timing, tone, and repetition start to matter. He is not discussing process in a calm, mutual, grounded way after two people have settled their emotional base. He is pushing toward process right after uncertainty has increased, right after marriage did not happen, right before Lisa returns to a place where she has more independence, more distance, and more room to rethink. His urgency does not sound like ordinary planning after security. It sounds like the search for security itself. That difference is huge. Then there is tone. The conversation does not read like two people gently mapping out a future together after a solid foundation has been built. It reads like someone trying to keep momentum from slipping. There is anxiety in it. There is insistence in it. There is a sense that action must happen fast because time itself is dangerous. And in relationships where one person fears the other might wake up once the emotion cools, speed becomes part of the strategy. Move before doubt grows. Push before distance settles in. Keep the promise alive before reality gets a vote. Then comes repetition. And repetition is where people often betray their center of gravity. If love is the heart and logistics are the necessary side topic, the language usually reflects that balance over time. But here the America route keeps pressing forward. The visa route keeps carrying weight. The possibility of her changing her mind keeps haunting him. He does not sound like a man merely discussing the practical road to preserve love. He sounds like a man who knows the road itself is what keeps the relationship from collapsing into uncertainty. That does not mean he felt no affection. That easy line is too neat and too lazy. The stronger reading is harsher because it is messier. Affection seems present, but affection is not driving alone. The visa looks like the structure holding the emotional language upright. Love gives the story its face. Immigration gives the story its bone. Without the future move to America hanging over this relationship, a lot of the urgency starts looking weaker. A lot of the tolerance starts looking harder to explain. A lot of the panic starts losing its shape. And once you see that, the goodbye changes again. Because now the airport scene is not carrying one burden. It is carrying several at once. It is carrying distance. It is carrying fear. It is carrying doubt. It is carrying the failed marriage timing. It is carrying the risk of delay. It is carrying the chance that once Lisa gets back to America, the whole emotional spell weakens and the practical path starts to fall apart. So when they cling to each other and cry, you are no longer looking at simple romance under pressure. You are looking at a goodbye loaded down with love language, legal anxiety, future risk, and one terrifying possibility hanging over all of it, which is that once she leaves, the relationship loses not only proximity, but momentum. Then the conversation turns to money, and that is where the romance starts losing its soft blur and the relationship starts entering the part no one can fake forever. Because tears are emotional, promises are flexible, chemistry is slippery, but money is blunt, money creates limits, money forces choices, and once Lisa says the spending stops, once she makes clear there is no more casual sending, no more open-ended help, no more constant financial cushioning, the whole story moves from fantasy into measurement. That shift matters because money does something tears never do. Money creates proof. A person can cry and still use you. A person can say all the right things and still be waiting for the next transfer. A person can sound heartbroken and still be calculating what dries up when you leave. That is why financial boundaries are so revealing in relationships built on unequal need. The minute one person says the support is ending, you get closer to the truth than any airport scene will ever take you. Love can survive a hard budget. Convenience usually struggles the second the tap gets turned off. Lisa, for once, sounds like someone trying to drag this relationship into adult reality. She has to go back to work. She has to make money again. She has to deal with legal process, survival, and the cost of moving this whole thing forward. That means every dollar has a job now. The money is no longer floating around inside the relationship like emotional padding. It has a purpose. Immigration process, lawyer fees, daily life, keeping herself afloat. That kind of statement changes the entire power balance because vague support becomes restricted support, and restricted support means the relationship has fewer places to hide. The dreamy version of this story depends on blur. Blur helps people stay hopeful. Blur lets them say we will figure it out. Blur lets one person keep asking and the other person keep giving without naming where the line is. Lisa, at least in this moment, tries to draw the line. She says no more spending like before. No more endless rescue mode. No more acting like love means permanent access to her wallet. If something is going to happen now, it has to happen within a structure. That sounds responsible, but it also sounds dangerous to anyone whose attachment is partly built on material support. And this is where the story becomes measurable. Not because money is the only issue, but because money exposes whether the emotional language holds up when support becomes conditional. If Daniel can stay steady, patient, and focused without repeated pressure, that complicates the scam reading. If he starts sliding into crisis talk, emergency talk, or guilt talk the second the boundary is set, then the audience gets a cleaner answer. Financial pressure has a way of stripping the poetry out of motive. It forces people to show whether they are attached to a person or attached to the benefits orbiting that person. Now, there is a fair reframe here, and it matters. Nigeria has real economic strain. Life is expensive. Instability is real. People do face genuine emergencies. Families lean on each other. Couples help each other. Not every request for money is exploitation. Not every urgent need is fake. That is the adult view, and pretending otherwise would make the analysis cheap. People living in hard conditions do not become suspicious by default simply because they need help. Reality is harsher than that. Bills arrive. Crises happen. Bad luck does not wait for a clean narrative, but fair-minded does not mean blind. The real question is not whether a single emergency could happen. Of course one could. The real question is pattern. When someone is in a relationship where immigration, access, and financial strain are already sitting at the center, the difference between real hardship and repeating pressure starts to matter a lot. One emergency is life. 5 emergencies tied to emotional timing start to look like leverage. One difficult moment is human. A cycle of problems that always seem to land when commitment needs reinforcing is something else. That is the gap the audience starts watching for. And that gap is exactly why Lisa's boundary matters so much. She is not only limiting the money, she is setting up a test whether she knows it or not. If the relationship can survive without endless informal support, then the emotional side gains some credibility. If the relationship starts filling up with reasons why the boundary has to bend, shift, pause, or disappear, then the visa anxiety and future talk start looking less like stress and more like dependency dressed up as devotion. Once money is restricted, every later request carries weight. Every need has context now. Every crisis has a history. This is also where the emotional story starts to lose its innocence. Before this point, people can still tell themselves the relationship is messy but meaningful, intense but real, unstable but full of feeling. Once money gets locked down, the relationship has to prove itself under pressure that feelings cannot smooth over. Patience gets tested. Motive gets tested. Timing gets tested. The space between affection and utility gets tested. That is why money boundaries expose motive better than tears. Tears tell you someone is upset. Money tells you what they do when comfort disappears. Daniel seems to accept the new rule on the surface, and of course he does, because pushing back too hard in that moment would be a mistake. Agreement is easy when the future still feels open. Agreement is easy when the first real challenge has not arrived yet. Agreement is easy when all the emotional fog of goodbye is still hanging in the air. The harder part comes later when the trip is over, the distance is real, the daily pressure starts building, and the first problem shows up with a sad tone and an urgent reason attached to it. That is where this story is quietly heading. Not toward one dramatic confession. Not toward one perfect reveal. Toward a pattern test. Because once Lisa says the money is done unless something serious happens, the audience is left waiting for the next move, and not in some vague way. In a specific way. Watching, counting, listening. Waiting to see how long it takes before love runs into need asks for help, and the first so-called emergency comes knocking. Right before the airport, Daniel seems to understand one thing with perfect clarity, which is that this relationship needs to leave the trip on a warm emotional note, or the whole mood risks collapsing the second Lisa gets back to America, So you can feel him leaning into softness, into tenderness, into the kind of language designed to leave a mark after separation, and this is where the story stops being easy. Because if he were cold, blunt, careless, or obviously detached, there would be nothing to study here. The audience would clock him in 5 seconds and move on, but he is not playing. It that simply, he is affectionate, he is sad, he sounds attached, he sounds grateful, he sounds like someone trying to hold on to the moment, and that is exactly why the read gets darker instead of cleaner. He talks about missing her. He talks about love. He talks like a man trying to make sure the final emotional memory is not the lies, not the stress, not the legal mess, not the awkward family pressure, but sweetness. That matters because people often reveal their priorities in the goodbye. A messy trip can be reframed if the final note lands right. A person can leave thinking maybe it was worth it after all. Maybe the bond is bigger than the chaos. Maybe the pain only made the love clearer. Daniel seems to be working in that space. He does not want this ending to feel jagged. He wants it to feel tender. He wants the last emotional taste to be soft enough to survive the distance. And to be fair, there's nothing fake by default about someone wanting to part gently. Most people do that. Most people want the final hours before separation to feel warm. They want reassurance. They want affection. They want one last emotional anchor to carry into the lonely part. That by itself proves nothing. But in this situation, the softness lands differently because of what is already hanging over the relationship. The failed marriage timing, the visa rush, the money boundary, the fear that once Lisa gets home, reality starts chewing through all the trip emotion. So when Daniel starts speaking in this sweeter, sadder register, the question is not whether the feeling exists. The question is what the feeling is serving. That is where the story gets sticky. Because feeling and self-interest do not cancel each other out. People like neat categories because neat categories are comforting. Villain or lover. User or believer. Scam or romance. Real life is uglier than that. A person can be attached and opportunistic at the same time. A person can enjoy comfort, affection, and emotional closeness while also needing what the relationship provides. A person can be sad to lose you and still be more terrified of losing the future linked to you. That is what makes Daniel harder to dismiss and harder to trust at the same time. If he felt nothing, Lisa's position would look foolish in a simple way. If he showed no softness, no sadness, no effort to leave things on a good note, then the whole relationship would flatten into one obvious lesson. But he does show feeling, and whether all of it is pure or mixed is the exact problem. Because mixed motives are harder to defend against. Mixed motives create confusion. They give people enough sincerity to keep hope alive and enough self-interest to make the whole thing unstable. That is a much more dangerous setup than plain fakeness, because plain fakeness is easier to spot once the mask slips. Mixed motives keep the mask human. Daniel's language before the airport seems built to do two things at once. It comforts Lisa emotionally and it protects the bond structurally. He is not only being kind, he is preserving connection. He is not only being sweet, he is helping the relationship leave the trip with emotional momentum. He is not only expressing sadness, he is reinforcing the idea that distance should not break what they have. None of that means the sadness is fake. It means the sadness is useful. That is a harder truth for people to sit with, but it is often the right one. Emotions are not less real because they are useful. They become more complicated because they are. And Lisa seems ready to receive every bit of that softness as proof. That is another reason this section matters. She appears to respond to emotional tone more than structural contradiction. If the goodbye feels loving, then the problems shrink for a moment. If he sounds wounded, then the fear of being used loses ground. If he speaks tenderly, then the whole relationship gets to keep breathing a little longer. That is not stupidity. That is emotional hunger meeting emotional performance, and when those two things lock together, people start protecting the moment that makes them feel chosen, even when the bigger pattern keeps throwing up warning signs. What makes Daniel's charm run so effective is that it does not have to be a cold performance to have strategic value. That is the trap. People assume manipulation always looks calculated and empty, but often it looks warm, sad, and deeply human. Often the person means some of what they say. Often they do miss you. Often they do feel the loss. The issue is not whether they feel it, the issue is whether their feeling points to the same future as yours. Lisa seems to hear his sadness and think we are bound by love. The darker read is that sadness does not tell you what the relationship is centered on. Sadness only tells you something is slipping away. And once you watch Daniel trying so hard to leave this trip on a sweet note, once you hear the soft language and see the emotional effort, the whole story gets heavier, not lighter, because the easiest answer would be that he is acting. But the more unsettling answer is that some part of him is not acting at all. Some part of him is attached. Some part of him will miss her. Some part of him does not want this to end in bitterness or failure. The problem is that none of those things answer the one question that keeps getting louder the closer they get to the airport, which is not whether Daniel feels bad, not whether Daniel cares in some form, but what exactly he is grieving. Then the airport scene hits in full. And this is where the whole relationship tries to make its strongest case in the most emotional way possible. Because once they are standing there holding each other, falling apart, dragging out the goodbye, and acting like letting go would break something permanent inside them, the scene starts pushing one message with all its force, which is simple, painful, and easy to buy. These two people must love each other. Otherwise, why would they look this destroyed? Why would they be clinging this hard? Why would even walking toward the gate feel like? Ripping skin off bone, and for a few seconds the scene almost gets away with that version. Lisa is crushed. There is no clever way around that. She looks like someone who does not want to leave, because leaving feels like betrayal, like distance, like risk, like the beginning of something slipping beyond her control. She is not acting like a woman calmly finishing a trip. She is acting like a woman trying to hold together a future she has already started living in her head. The goodbye hurts her before she even goes inside. You can feel the dread on her. This is not one neat sad moment at the end of a visit. This is the collapse of a fantasy she wanted to keep alive a little longer, maybe a lot longer. She wanted closeness to keep doing the work. She wanted presence to beat doubt. She wanted the relationship to stay emotional, immediate, and warm. The airport kills all of that in one shot. Daniel meets that pain with his own, and this is where the scene becomes impossible to read in a clean way, because he does not look detached, bored, or relieved. He looks panicked. He looks overwhelmed. He looks like a man trying to stop time with his arms. He tells her when she gets sad to look at his picture, and that line is so soft and so simple that it almost works like a spell. It sounds intimate. It sounds sincere. It sounds like the kind of thing people say when they want their face to remain in the other person's life after the body leaves. It is a tiny line, but it carries weight because it shows him trying to plant himself in her memory before distance starts doing damage. Then comes the fear of never seeing each other again, and that fear changes the temperature of the whole scene. Now it is not only a sad goodbye. Now it is a goodbye haunted by uncertainty. The hug gets tighter. The panic gets louder. Neither one wants to be the first to release the other, because releasing the hug starts to feel like admitting the future is no longer in their hands. That is the emotional center of the whole story. The airport forces both of them into the same image of pain, the same frame, the same body language, the same desperate need to hold on for 1 second longer. On the surface, the image is brutal and straightforward. Two people are in pain. Two people do not want this to end. Two people are scared the relationship might not survive distance, delay, and the reality waiting on the other side of departure. That reading is not false. It is the visible layer, and it matters because pain is still pain, even when the reasons underneath it are split. The scene lands because they are both hurting. No one has to fake every emotion in order for the relationship to still be unequal. That is the harder truth sitting inside this goodbye. Underneath that visible layer, the motives start separating again. Lisa looks like someone terrified of losing love. She is grieving the bond itself, the romance, the closeness, the feeling that after all the drama and all the mess, she still found someone to fight for. Her panic feels emotional in the most direct way. She is not trying to hold on to a process, she is trying to hold on to a person and the meaning she has attached to him. She wants the relationship to remain alive as a source of affection, validation, and future companionship. When she falls apart, the grief reads like love mixed with fear. Daniel's grief looks real too, but the shape of it keeps pointing somewhere darker. He is not only losing the woman in front of him, he is also staring at the possible loss of the future linked to her. Lisa is not simply Lisa in this scene. She is also America, movement, process, possibility, and the plan that did not get locked in on this trip. That is why his panic carries more than heartbreak. It carries risk. Once she boards that plane, she returns to a world where the trip glow fades, where work, money, legal problems, and second thoughts get louder, where promises start competing with reality. He seems to know all of that, which means his fear is doing double duty. He is losing proximity and he is losing control over what happens next. That split is what gives the scene its sting. The hug is one thing and two things at once. Lisa is holding on because she fears the relationship dying. Daniel is holding on because he fears the future route slipping out of his hands. Lisa is mourning love as she understands it. Daniel is mourning the chance that what he has built with her might fail before it turns into something permanent. Same tears, same arms, same airport floor under their feet, different center of gravity. And that is why this goodbye feels both sincere and unstable at the same time, because the image begs you to read it as one shared heartbreak while the story underneath keeps pulling it apart until the most painful part of the whole scene is no longer the crying by itself, but the fact that the same image is carrying two meanings at once the plane leaves and the trip ends. The relationship loses the one thing that had been doing most of the heavy lifting, which is intensity. Because trips like this can keep almost anything alive for a while, especially when emotions are running hot. Conflict keeps resetting the stakes, and every day feels like a decision point. But daily life is much less generous than a trip. Daily life is repetitive, slower, colder, and far less interested in fantasy. So the second Lisa goes back to work and Daniel stays behind with his fear, the question changes from do they feel something to will what they feel survive structure? That is where this story gets less dramatic on the surface and more serious underneath. Airports are loud. Waiting is quiet. A hug can look convincing in 1 minute. 6 months of delay asks harder questions. Who calls when nothing new has happened? Who stays patient when the process drags? Who gets irritated when boredom replaces urgency? Who starts sounding distant when routine takes over? Who keeps investing when there is no immediate reward? That is the part relationships hate, because routine strips away the theater and leaves people alone with their actual reason. Distance by itself is not the villain people make it out to be. Strong relationships survive distance all the time. People wait, people work, people plan. People deal with immigration systems, money problems, time zone nonsense, and the slow grind of process. Distance does not destroy aligned couples on its own. What distance does do, fast and without mercy, is expose weak alignment. When two people want the same future for the same reason, distance hurts, but it does not instantly rot the bond. When two people are attached to different outcomes, distance starts pulling those outcomes apart almost immediately. That is why the future pressure in this story matters so much. Visa delays are not romantic. Scrutiny is not romantic. Work is not romantic. Bills are not romantic. Waiting is not romantic. These are all the parts of reality that force people to stop living inside the emotional peak of the trip and start proving what remains once the peak drops. Lisa goes back to America where life starts crowding in again. Work, money, exhaustion, legal questions, time. Friends or family with opinions, her own private doubts creeping back in when no one is there to hold her and tell her to keep believing. Daniel stays in a space where his future still depends on movement, but movement is no longer immediate. That is a brutal setup for any bond already running on mixed motives. Then boredom enters, and boredom wrecks weakly built relationships faster than big drama does. Big drama at least keeps people activated. Boredom makes them honest. Once there is no airport, no trip, no daily closeness, no fresh reconciliation after conflict, people start facing the dead time between promises and outcome. That dead time is where attention wanders. Patience wears thin. Temptation grows. Someone starts feeling neglected. Someone starts feeling trapped. Someone starts wanting proof again. Someone starts wanting money again. Someone starts sounding a little less sweet, a little more sharp, a little more tired, and then there is scrutiny. Immigration processes are slow enough without extra complications, and this situation does not exactly scream clean and simple. Waiting under scrutiny is its own kind of emotional pressure because every delay invites a new insecurity. Is the delay normal? or a sign? Is the silence temporary or the start of withdrawal? Is the relationship strong enough to survive months of maybe? People who are aligned can move through that with stress, but people with mismatched motives start cracking in revealing ways. One person grows more anxious about the bond. The other grows more anxious about the result. Same delay. Different panic. Money stress sits in the middle of all of this like a timer. Lisa has already made clear that her spending has limits now. That means daily life is not only emotional, it is financial. She has to earn. She has to stabilize. She has to think about process in practical terms. Daniel has to live with the fact that wanting movement does not create movement. If frustration starts building, it will not float in some abstract emotional cloud. It will land in conversations, requests, resentments, and expectations. That is where the relationship starts showing what it is made of without the trip glow covering the crack. The darker possibility is not only that distance weakens love. The darker possibility is that distance exposes that love was never the sole center holding this together. Lisa might start realizing how much of her attachment needed constant emotional contact to feel convincing. Daniel might start revealing how much of his attachment needed visible progress to stay warm. Once each person loses the thing that kept them emotionally fed during the trip, what is left starts looking smaller, thinner, and less stable. That is why this phase of the story matters more than the airport in one brutal sense. The airport gave them a grand emotional image. Daily reality gives them a test. No audience, no dramatic music in people's heads, no final hug to romanticize. Only time, pressure, silence, delay, and the slow, boring grind that forces motive to stand on its own legs. And once you reach that point, the airport starts looking less like the truth of the relationship and more like its last fantasy, the final emotional scene before reality starts asking what was ever holding this together in the first place. By the end of this story, the laziest takeaway would be to slap one ugly label on Daniel, call Lisa a fool, and pretend the whole thing is solved. But that cheap version misses the part that makes this relationship worth watching in the first place, because the reason this goodbye sticks in people's heads is not that one person felt nothing and the other felt everything. The reason it sticks is that both of them seemed emotional. Both of them seemed frightened. Both of them were holding on like something huge was slipping away. And yet once you line up everything they said, everything they pushed for, and everything they feared most, the shape of their attachment was not the same. Lisa seems to love what she believes this relationship means. That distinction matters. Not only Daniel as a person, but Daniel as a source of romance, future, closeness, and a kind of emotional victory after all the lies, all the chaos, all the embarrassment, all the effort. She wants the suffering to lead somewhere tender. She wants the mess to pay out in devotion. She wants the relationship to stand for love surviving pressure. That is why she keeps reading survival as proof, why she keeps treating emotional intensity like evidence, and why the airport hits her like the loss of something sacred instead of the interruption of something uncertain. In her mind, this relationship means she was not foolish for hoping. It means all the struggle still led to a person who chose her. Daniel seems attached too, but his attachment points towards something more conditional and more practical. He does not come off like a man who feels nothing. That easy read never fit the footage. He cries. He softens. He tries to leave a sweet emotional imprint. He clearly does not want the connection to break. But his language keeps circling back to movement, certainty, America, timing, and the risk that Lisa might change her mind once distance starts cooling everything down. That does not erase his affection. It rearranges it. His emotional investment appears tied not only to Lisa herself, but to what staying connected to Lisa might deliver. That is what keeps making the whole thing feel uneasy. So the full payoff is not fake love against real love. That is too childish for a situation this messy. The fuller truth is rougher. Both people felt something. Both people feared losing something. Both people needed this relationship to keep meaning something after all the damage. But the future each one was reaching for was not the same future. Lisa was holding on to love as identity, as validation, as emotional payoff, as the promise that all this madness still adds up to a bond worth defending. Daniel was holding on to love as connection, yes, but also as pathway, structure, and possibility. Lisa was trying to save the meaning of the relationship. Daniel was trying to save the outcome attached to it. That is why the tears feel sincere and suspect at the same time. Sincere because pain was there. Suspect because pain by itself does not tell you what a person is protecting. Someone crying can be grieving romance. Someone crying can be grieving loss of opportunity. Someone crying can be grieving both at once. People keep wanting tears to function like a lie detector, but tears are useless at that job. They show distress. They do not explain motive. And in this story, motive is the whole point. That is also why the relationship never fully settles into a clean moral lesson. Lisa is not purely innocent. She lies. She pushes fantasy too hard. She mistakes intensity for certainty. She treats future promises like present proof. Daniel is not purely simple either. He does not look empty. He looks mixed. He looks like a man whose affection and self-interest are sitting in the same body at the same time, which is far more believable and far more dangerous than some flat cartoon version of a scammer. Mixed motives confuse people because the warmth is not fully fake. The attachment is not fully false. The danger lives in the misalignment. And that misalignment is what doomed this thing long before the airport. Not because there was no feeling, but because the feeling was tied to different hopes. Lisa wanted the relationship to confirm a romantic story. Daniel wanted the relationship to secure a future step. Same bond, different center, same goodbye, different dread, same tears, different threat. That is why the airport scene lands like tragedy while still feeling unstable. The image says soulmates in pain. The pattern says two people squeezing different dreams into one relationship and praying the difference never gets exposed. Once you see that, the ending becomes a lot clearer. The biggest red flag was never only the lies, the awkward sex talk, the family pressure, the money problem, or even the visa urgency by itself. The biggest red flag was that both people kept speaking the language of commitment while quietly aiming at different destinations. That is the kind of relationship that can survive drama for a while, survive distance for a while, even survive humiliation for a while, but once time forces the motives into the open, the bond starts collapsing under the weight of its own contradiction. So the clean takeaway is this: shared emotion does not prove shared intention. And that is why this story connects so hard to the next one. Because there is another couple where the romance looked intense on camera, the goodbye looked devastating, and the love talk sounded convincing right up until the private motives started pulling in opposite directions.